History teaching should be more socially and culturally inclusive, and should also explain the role played by the climate change in the rise and fall of human societies. And should also explain that migration is something natural. Humans have always migrated from one place to another, and all of us are migrants, in fact. But the perception of those topics can change from country to country, mainly because of our history. For this reason, we asked for a lecture to Miguel Barros, who is the president of the Portuguese Association of History Teachers. He explained us how those concepts are represented in history courses in Portugal.
Thank you, Marco. Hi, everyone. With this presentation, I will attempt to address one of the most uncomfortable topics in Portuguese history and in history teaching in Portugal: the role that Portugal played in the forced migration of millions of black people from Africa to the Americas and to Europe, and also the role that Portugal played in the development of racism. Related to the teaching of history, when addressing these issues in the classroom, we have to be aware of the sensibilities that we may encounter. Portugal is a multicultural society with many students of African origin in the classrooms, and the historical narratives that were prevalent in the disciplinary programs and in the textbooks until recently were very much the ones of the colonizers, very marked by the nationalist, imperialist and racist ideologies from the 19th and 20th centuries. We are going to address in this presentation the following issues: the roots of Portuguese racism, otherness, skin color and racism, the settling of racism through dehumanization and exclusion, the daily resistance of enslaved people, voices against slavery, the exclusion-inclusion of black peoples in history teaching, and the necessary decolonization of education. Inclusion and exclusion are very much a part of this presentation. Only recently, since 2018, the Portuguese educational system realized that inclusion also meant a change on the way historical narratives were presented to the students. These narratives tended to belittle the enslavement of people and the presence of black Africans in the fabric of the Portuguese society since the 16th century. They ignored almost completely the fact that Portugal was one of the main actors on the transportation of millions of human beings from Africa to the Americas and Europe. Putting aside the prejudices against black peoples in the classical antiquity, we can trace the process of racialization in Europe to medieval times, when a racialized way of thinking was established, one that would have, in various forms, a long existence, lasting until today: the belief in the power of blood as a transmitter of qualities and effects. Let's analyze the Portuguese roots of racism. Related to the idea of transmission of qualities and effects through blood, we have the notion that religious beliefs could somehow contaminate one's descent. These applied from the Middle Ages through to the 19th century to Moors and Jews. With the arrival of the enslaved people from Africa and the intermarriages that inevitably followed, this idea of pollution of the blood passed on to the descendants of mixed couples, the mulattoes. The descendants of Jews and Moors were not allowed to hold public office functions or to belong to brotherhoods, for instance. The idea of the pollution of the descendants' blood was extended to the descendants of mixed couples, the mulattoes. This document shows exactly that, with an inquiry being made when somebody applied to be a brother to investigate if that person was not infected. Notice the choice of this word. This chronology shows the evolution of the process of capture and, later on, of commerce of enslaved people in Portugal. The relevant date is 1448, when the piracy activities were forbidden, giving place to the trade with locals, taking advantage of the wars between the African peoples. The source is a description of how the activities of piracy took place. It's interesting to notice that in this document the captured people are referred as males and females and not as men and women. This document is a seminal one for the history of slavery in Portugal and its empire. Describes the arrival in Lagos, Algarve, of the first captured people by Portuguese boats at the service of Prince Henry the Navigator, the man that financed, through the capitals of the Order of Christ, of which he was the governor, the exploitation of the West African coast. It's the first written example of racialization based on skin color, with many subsequent prejudices here stated. Among them, the enslaved people were some of reasonable whiteness, beautiful and well-formed. Others were less white, resembling browns. Others as black as Ethiopians, so unattractive both in their faces and bodies that it almost seemed to the men guarding them that they were seeing images from the lower hemisphere. Notice the connection between whiteness and beauty. The following documents, of which these are just a small sample, show us the process of racialization and dehumanization of blacks that took place in Portugal. This image, a fantastic source, shows us the crest of one of the richest merchants of Lisbon, a merchant that for some years had the exclusive of trade of the West African coast. His crest represents the two commodities that made his fortune, the yellow and the black gold. Objectifying or animalizing the other is an obvious way of dehumanizing him or her, thus setting aside moral and ethical issues. We must remind ourselves that the Catholic Church considered all human beings part of the same family, divided in groups after the building of the Tower of Babel. This source, a law from 1512-1513, shows us how human beings are under a warranty, the same way that also were other goods, such as beasts. Similarly, this charter of a town in the vicinities of Lisbon is very telling of the mindset that was already fully installed in the beginning of the 16th century. Notice that the slaves are positioned in the charter between hunting and cloth, and that in the description of price values they are mixed with beasts, riding horse, mule, mare and donkey. Notice also another interesting particularity. The word mula, meaning mule in English, gave origin to the Portuguese word mulato. This source is a shocking one. From 1571 is a description by a foreigner of the breeding of slaves, in this case in the grounds of the House of Bragança, the Dukedom of Bragança. Exaggerated or not in the details, this was a reality that, although not widespread, was, according to some authors, present also in some convents from all places. The dehumanization of the enslaved people happened also after death, with their bodies thrown into piles of rubbish or disposed in common graves. The building of specific places of burial was connected with hygienic measures and not with ethical issues. The relations between the enslaved people and the rest of the population were often problematic, leading to public disorder. Trying to solve these issues, the authorities of Lisbon issued a series of regulations, namely connected with the access to drinkable water available in the crowded fountains of the city. Notice that the origin of Lisbon slaves was varied. Although most of them were black Africans, there were also many Indians, Bengalis, Amerindians, Malayans, Japanese, Chinese, etc. There was also, which we often forget, resistance from the part of the enslaved, of which this source is only one example. The resistance could take many forms. Running away, probably the most common, given the fact that it is highly regulated by the laws, would be the most radical form of resistance. The one presented here constitutes another, softer example of resistance. A few intellectuals, men of church or laymen, were against the institution of slavery. The two examples given here are from the middle of the 16th century and from the middle of the 18th century. Both condemned slavery, the first one even going to the point of stating that the Portuguese were the inventors of such a horrible practice. On a more positive note, the enslaved people, African or otherwise, when they had descendants, they mingled into the Portuguese society. These sources are examples of that and also of the fondness that sometimes their owners had for them. Another example, this one showing how attitudes were slowly changing. The prohibition of Moors, Jews, or mulattoes to belong to brotherhoods or to be officers of a trade or to run shops was being often ignored, already for quite a while. In 1763, a law established the end of the legal distinction between Old and New Christians, finishing with the associated prohibitions, and the same happened to mulattoes. This picture, from the first years of the 20th century, is rather telling of the mindset similar to what was happening in the colonies of other empires. Slavery had been eradicated, but it had been substituted by forced labor. Note on this picture the body language of the white man on the left. Portugal was the last colonial empire. It refused to grant independence to its colonies and hanged on to them until the Revolution of 1974 that overthrew the Portuguese dictatorship. Portugal, condemned by the majority of the countries that composed the UN, continued through the 40s and 50s to make use of forced labor. Only in 1961, for various reasons that we will exploit ahead, forced labor was finally illegalized. This source tells eloquently how the Portuguese colonial administration dealt with the forced laborers. In fact, this is what colonial discourse does, creates a stereotype with deep roots. The black, the native, is uncivilized, doesn't like to work, is lazy. So it needs to be disciplined because that is for his or hers own good. And then, in March 1961, everything changed. Cotonang, a company that employed forced laborers, faces a strike. The Portuguese authorities respond violently. The Portuguese Air Force uses napalm in this attack, a prelude to what was going to happen later, after the colonial war started. Partially, in response to the Portuguese attacks on the workers of Baixa do Cassange, UPA, an organization that fought for the independence of Angola, massacres hundreds of Portuguese settlers and of Africans that worked for them. As a result of this attack, the Portuguese government, run by Salazar, sends thousands of troops and equipment to Angola. It was the beginning of a war that lasted for 13 years and spread to two more fronts, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. The film that we are going to see shows images taken by the Portuguese TV just after the attacks against the Portuguese settlers and of the evacuation of the surviving ones.
Angola, situada na costa ocidental da África Austral, o maior e mais rico território ultramarino, é atacada na manhã de 15 de março. A região dos Dembos, noroeste de Angola, foi o lugar da tragédia. Grupos de camponeses bacongos e elementos da UPA, União dos Povos de Angola, movimento dirigido por Oltan Roberto a partir do ex-Congo belga, espalham a destruição e a morte. Morrem centenas de europeus e mais de 1000 africanos. Homens, mulheres e crianças são brutalmente assassinados. Milhares de colonos em pânico são conduzidos para Luanda. Reina a desorientação. A ação relâmpago da UPA não obtém os efeitos esperados, o abandono em massa dos colonos portugueses, como acontecera no vizinho Congo, mas inicia uma guerra que vai durar 13 anos.
These images and others, much more explicit, like the ones of dead raped bodies of white women, were broadcasted all over Portugal at dinner time. In a country in which nudity, sex scenes, and extreme violence were censored from films tells us a lot about the intentions of the broadcasting. As a result of the international pressure and of the start of the colonial war, the dictatorial Portuguese government promulgates a law that finally revokes the indigenous labor code that allowed forced labor. The condition of African workers improved. And now we are going to see how Africans represented in history textbook, how is slavery taught, and how is racism addressed. Curiously, between 1962 and 1974, in the final 12 years of the dictatorship, there is a big change. These issues that were hardly talked about before, in the previous decades, are now dealt with. This is a documentary film done by Italians. It became a big success in the 1960s and, although not made by Portuguese, its message fits like a glove the Portuguese government position to fight for the possession of the colonies. The documentary clearly, heavily sinned, reasons about how Africa is or will be worst after the Europeans left or will leave. At some point, the narrator even laments that the Portuguese have consistently tried to integrate black Africans into society, while the Portuguese settlers were hated and shunned in return.
The Africa of Vasco da Gama and the great Portuguese explorers, the oldest white Africa south of the Sahara, awakens from a long sleep. For 400 years, nothing has visited this fortress, nothing but the weather. Once the Portuguese Empire stretched from India to the Americas, now all that remain of the glories of the past are crumbling stone ramparts, mute, rusting cannons, and 2 colonies in Africa. But Portugal is reluctant to give them up. They're all she has. Just outside the crumbling walls, there's a new reality, the guerrilla war of the Angolan nationalist rebels. But in the heavy morning mist, the patrolling Portuguese soldiers still seem like ghosts of the past. Whenever man is present, animals and birds hush their normal chatter, and the jungle falls silent. It's an unmistakable sign which the rebels know only too well. Now they avoid such pockets of silence. They know that the Portuguese patrols will be there waiting. But after much frustration, the Portuguese have devised a clever solution.
Aves artificiais, 3, 2, 1, vamos.
It's a trick that almost always works. Animals and rebels respond to the tape's electric cry, and instantly the jungle fills with life and death. in Angola, the whites claim to ignore the colors of human skin. Aquí es Portugal, they said. Here is Portugal. Brancos y pretos son todos portugueses. Blacks and whites are all Portuguese. But in 400 years, until the revolution, less than 0.5% of Angola's blacks were granted citizenship. So now the rebels say, this is Africa, and only blacks are African. White and black. Brancos y pretos. An urgent problem that hate is staining blood red.
For instance, in this textbook from 1966, it is acknowledged that sugar, a commodity that provided many riches, was the result of captive labor. Also, that the African element is present in the making of the Portuguese nation, namely through the use of slaves in Madeira and in the Azores. This more inclusive narrative was the result of international pressure and of the colonial war. Portugal wanted to be seen as a multiracial nation with overseas provinces, where people of all colors lived essentially in harmony, counteracting the international and African narrative. After the revolution during the 80s, the 90s, and up to 2018, the narrative became surprisingly less inclusive, at least in these aspects that we referred. Portugal wanted to rearrange its relationship with the ex-colonies, now independent countries. These had several serious internal problems, namely civil wars, so these matters mattered less. With no surprise, we see textbooks where even the aspect of the human African contribution to the Portuguese nation disappeared. Instead, on a time of European integration, the settlers from Flanders were favored. From 2018 onwards, a task began with the collaboration of the Portuguese History Teachers Association, changing the programs in a way that they would fit the multicultural Portuguese society, where the descendants of African migrants would be represented, and not only as products of the age of discoveries. And so, the new guidelines were promulgated with immediate consequences in the way the textbooks present their narratives.